Last month, a 75-year-old woman gripped my hand tightly and whispered through tears, "I gave everything to my family, my time, my dreams, my youth. Now, when I need someone most, my calls go to voicemail. My home sits empty on holidays. Tell me, what did I do wrong?" Her words weren't just a question. They were the echo of an entire generation wondering why the love they poured out so generously hasn't flowed back to them in their time of need. Have you ever looked down at your hands? Hands that prepared countless meals, that rocked children to sleep, that worked tirelessly to provide, and wondered, now that these hands are tired, who will hold them? Have you felt the sharp contrast between the bustling home you once maintained and the quiet rooms that now hold only memories? Have you wondered if a lifetime of putting others first has left you last in line when your own needs arise? Today, I want to share with you the unspoken truth about the imbalance of giving and receiving that so many face in their golden years. But more importantly, I'll show you how to find the care and love you deserve, beginning with learning to give it to yourself after decades of placing others first. Let's start with Elizabeth's story, a woman who spent 50 years being everything to everyone, only to find herself wondering if she had somehow become invisible. Let me tell you about Elizabeth. At 73, she lives alone in a modest 2-bedroom home where she raised 3 children. On her mantle, family photos tell the story of a life dedicated to others, her children's graduations, weddings, and the births of grandchildren she helped care for. What the photos don't show are the invisible threads of sacrifice woven through those moments. The nursing degree she abandoned when her first child was born, the promotion she declined that would have required travel, the aging parents she cared for in this very living room while simultaneously raising teenagers, the thousands of meals prepared, clothes mended, fevers monitored, and tears dried, all while keeping her own dreams carefully folded away for someday. "I always believed that someday it would come," Elizabeth told me, her fingers tracing the edge of a photo frame. Someday, when the children were grown. Samita, why when they had their own families? Someday, when they would remember all I had done and naturally want to be part of my life the way I had been part of theirs. But someday arrived with a painful reality. Her children, now in their 40s with busy careers and children of their own, call occasionally and visit on major holidays. Last year, when Elizabeth needed knee surgery, her daughter came for 2 days before explaining she needed to get back to work. Her son sent flowers, but he lived too far to visit. The grandchildren have activities every weekend that take precedence over visiting their grandmother. "It wasn't supposed to be this way," Elizabeth whispered, struggling to voice the thought that haunts so many in her generation. "I gave them everything. I thought that's what love was, giving until it hurt, then giving more. I never expected repayment, exactly, but I did expect presence, attention, to matter in their lives the way they mattered in mine." This painful imbalance, a lifetime of giving followed by years of quiet neglect, is something I hear about constantly in my work with older adults. The mother who raised 5 children is now spending holidays alone. The father who worked 2 jobs to put his kids through college is now wondering why they're too busy to call. The grandmother who babysat grandchildren for years now said that weekend visits are too difficult to schedule. What's happening here isn't just about ungrateful children or selfish younger generations. It's about a fundamental shift in how family connections function across generations, and a gap between what our parents and grandparents expected from family life and what actually unfolds in today's fragmented, geographically scattered world. Most people now in their 60s, 70s, and beyond grew up in a world where family ties were geographical as well as emotional. Extended families often live within miles of each other. Caring for aging parents wasn't just expected. It was logistically possible in ways that today's scattered families find challenging. The cultural message was clear. You sacrifice for your children and later, they care for you. The cycle was supposed to be complete, but something broke in that cycle. Adult children move away for education and careers. The demands of modern work left little room for caregiving. Technology created a connection, but also a distraction. The very success parents work so hard to give their children, the education, the opportunities, the chance for a bigger life, took those children farther away, both physically and emotionally. For Elizabeth, The realization that her children weren't going to provide the companionship and care she had envisioned wasn't sudden. It accumulated in small moments. The unanswered calls, the rushed visits, the conversations that skimmed the surface of life rather than diving deep. The grandchildren were too busy with sports and friends to spend time with her. The holidays where she felt more like an obligation than a beloved matriarch. I kept thinking I was doing something wrong, Elizabeth confessed. That if I were more interesting, less needy, more tech-savvy, they would want to be around me more. I started shrinking myself, becoming smaller and less demanding, hoping that would make me more acceptable. Anyone who has ever loved a child recognizes this instinct. To make yourself smaller, to take up less space, to accommodate rather than inconvenience. But for Elizabeth, as for so many others, this self-diminishment only deepened her isolation. The turning point came on a winter morning when Elizabeth looked in the mirror and really saw herself. Not as a mother, a grandmother, or a widow, but simply as a human being who had spent 7 decades prioritizing others' needs above her own. In that moment of clarity, she asked herself a question that would change everything. Who is giving to me now? And if the answer is no one, what am I going to do about it? That question marked the beginning of Elizabeth's transformation. Not an easy one, filled with tears and moments of anger, but a necessary journey nonetheless. She began to recognize how her entire identity had been constructed around caring for others. Being needed wasn't just something she did, it was who she was. And when that role diminished, she felt not only abandoned but erased. I realized I didn't know who I was outside of what I did for others, she said. I'd spent so long being someone's mother, someone's wife, someone's daughter, someone's grandmother, that I'd never really asked myself what I wanted simply as Elizabeth. This pattern, building an identity entirely around caregiving, is particularly common among women of Elizabeth's generation, though men experience it too. Society expected women to find fulfillment primarily through nurturing others. Self-sacrifice wasn't just encouraged, it was glorified. To prioritize one's own needs was considered selfish at best, shameful at worst. For Robert, a 78-year-old retired factory worker, the dynamic manifested differently but led to the same painful outcome. I wasn't a nurturing type like my wife, he explained, but I showed my love by providing. 60-hour weeks, never missing a day, taking any overtime they'd give me, make sure my kids could have things I never had, good schools, college funds, their first cars. Robert's children grew up with opportunities he could only have dreamed of. They became successful professionals who now live comfortable lives in distant cities. They send checks at Christmas, he said with a tight smile, like they're paying me back for what I spent on them. But what I want is their time, not their money. I want them to sit on my porch and just talk to me. Both Elizabeth and Robert discovered a hard truth. Their children had unconsciously learned to see their parents' sacrifices as the baseline, the expected norm, rather than extraordinary act of love that demanded reciprocation. The parents saw each sacrifice as a deposit in an emotional bank account that would someday provide returns in the form of care and companionship. The children, never having discussed this unspoken contract, didn't realize such an account existed. Understanding this disconnect was the first step in healing. It required acknowledging the pain without letting it harden into bitterness. It meant recognizing that their adult children were navigating a world very different from the one they'd grown up in. One with 2 career households, longer work hours, and complex child-rearing pressures. My daughter Alexandra has 2 children, a demanding career, and a husband who traveled for work, Elizabeth reflected. When I look objectively at her life, I see that she's drowning in responsibilities. My disappointment doesn't change that reality, and holding on to that hurt only keeps us both stuck. For Robert, the realization came during a health scare that landed him in the hospital. My son called every day, but couldn't leave his job to visit. At first, I was angry. Then I remembered how I'd missed his college graduation because the plant was on overtime that weekend, and we needed the money. I'd made my choices based on what I thought showing love meant. He was doing the same. This isn't about excusing absence or neglect. It's about understanding that many of our expectations about how family relationships should function in our later years were formed in a different era with different constraints. This understanding doesn't eliminate the loneliness, but it does create space for new possibilities to emerge. For Elizabeth, healing began with small, deliberate steps towards self-knowledge. She started asking herself questions she'd never considered important before. What foods do I actually enjoy? Not just what's easy to prepare. What time of day do I naturally feel most energetic? What activities engage my mind in ways that make time disappear? It sounds so simple, she said, but I realized I'd spent decades conforming to others' rhythms and preferences. I didn't even know what my favorite color was because I'd always deferred to what my husband or children liked. Learning to pay attention to my own preferences felt almost rebellious. This rebellion, the quiet insistence on finally matching to herself, gradually expanded. Elizabeth began setting boundaries around her time and energy. She stopped being instantly available for last-minute babysitting. She declined holiday hosting when it felt overwhelming rather than joyful. She started a small savings account specifically for activities that brought her pleasure, no justification required. These small acts of self-acknowledgement gradually led Elizabeth to the first essential lesson. Self-care isn't selfish, it's necessary. This wasn't an easy concept for someone raised to believe that putting herself last was a virtue. Every time she prioritized her own needs, a wave of guilt would follow. Who do you think you are? A voice inside would ask. Your children need you. Your grandchildren need you. How dare you choose yourself? Recognizing and countering this internal voice became a daily practice. I started saying to myself what I would say to a dear friend, Elizabeth explained. Would I tell a friend she was selfish for wanting companionship? For wanting to be treated with care? For having needs? Of course not. So why was I saying these things to myself? Over time, Elizabeth developed concrete practices that helped to provide for herself the care others weren't consistently offering. She created comfortable rituals around meal times, so eating alone felt like a pleasure rather than a deprivation. She joined a walking group at her local park, combining physical health with social connection. She scheduled regular calls with distant friends, marking them on her calendar with the same importance she once gave family obligations. The strangest thing happened, she reflected. When I stopped waiting for others to fill my cup and started filling it myself, I actually had more to give. The times I did spend with family were richer because I wasn't approaching them from a place of emptiness and need. Margaret, 80, experienced something similar after her husband died. She found herself constantly at the beck and call of her adult daughter, who seemed to think Margaret's time had no value now that she was alone. I was driving across town 3 times a week to watch my grandchildren for minutes or hours with no advance notice, Margaret recalled. I was exhausted, my own home was neglected, and I felt used rather than valued. With tremendous difficulty, Margaret learned to say no. The first time was terrifying. She was certain her daughter would respond with anger or, worse, withdraw access to the grandchildren. Instead, her daughter adjusted. She began planning better and asking for help with more notice. Their relationship, after some initial tension, actually improved. She sees me differently now, Margaret observed. Not just as a convenient resource, but as a person with my own life and needs. This leads to the second vital lesson. Building a support network beyond family is essential. Both Elizabeth and Margaret found that developing diverse social connections provided stability and joy that depending solely on family could not. For Frank, a 70-year-old widower, this network emerged through his local veterans group. After Linda died, my kids called regularly for a few months. Then life got in the way, he said. I could have sat around resenting them, but instead, I went back to the VFW post I'd avoided for years. Turns out, those guys understood me in ways my own family couldn't. They knew what I'd been through. We speak the same language. Frank now volunteers at the post 3 days a week, coordinates transportation for older veterans to medical appointments, and hosts weekly card games at his home. My son visited last month and said, "Dad, you seem happier than I've seen you in years." He's right. I found my tribe. They're not replacing my family, but they're filling spaces my family couldn't fill anyway. Elizabeth found her community through a painting class at the senior center. Margaret joined a travel club for seniors that organizes day trips and occasional longer excursions. Robert discovered a men's coffee group at his church. What all these connections have in common is that they're based on shared interests and experiences rather than obligation, resulting in relationships that nourish rather than deplete. The third lesson emerging from these stories is perhaps the most challenging. Redefining relationships with adult children requires letting go of expectations while maintaining healthy boundaries. This doesn't mean accepting neglect or disrespect. Rather, it means approaching these relationships with fresh eyes, without the weight of unmet expectations. Louise, 67, transformed her strained relationship with her daughter through this approach. "I stopped keeping score," she said. "I stopped thinking about what she should be doing based on what I'd done as a daughter to my own mother. Instead, I focused on appreciating what she could give, which was different but not less valuable." This meant acknowledging the quality of their interaction when they were together, rather than dwelling on the quantity of visits or calls. It meant recognizing her daughter's expressions of love, sending articles she thought Louise would enjoy, remembering details about her friends, making her favorite dessert when she visited, even if those expressions didn't match Louise's expectations. At the same time, Louise established clearer boundaries. I stopped dropping everything whenever she called. I let her know when behaviors hurt me, rather than suffering in silence. And I became clearer about what I needed, not as demands, but as honest communication. Elizabeth, Robert, Margaret, Frank, and Louise all journeyed from a place of hurt and expectation to something new, not perfect, not what they had envisioned, but something that allowed them to reclaim their sense of worth and find care in unexpected places. Each started with the same painful question: after all I've given, why am I receiving so little in return? But they didn't stay stuck there. They moved forward into a more nuanced understanding of love across generations, and most importantly, a deeper relationship with themselves. Perhaps the greatest paradox of life is this: you cannot continue to give if you never learn to receive. And sometimes the person who needs to begin giving to you is yourself. This is a lesson Elizabeth, Robert, and so many others discovered after decades of putting everyone else first. They learned that self-nurturing isn't a luxury. It's as essential as the air we breathe, especially in these later years when the giving scales may have tipped too far in one direction. The sacrifices you made over a lifetime weren't wasted. The love you pour into children, partners, parents, friends, it wasn't for nothing. It shaped lives, built foundations, and created ripples that extend far beyond what you can see. But now, in this quieter season, it's time to direct some of that immense capacity for love inward, not from a place of bitterness or resentment, but from the deep understanding that you are worthy of the same care you've so freely given to others. When I look at Elizabeth today, I see someone who has found a peace that eluded her for years. "I still love my children deeply," she told me recently, "but I no longer depend on them exclusively for my sense of purpose or connection. My happiness is my responsibility, and that's not a burden, it's freedom." If today's conversation has touched something in your heart, I invite you to share in the comments one small way you'll care for yourself this week. It doesn't need to be grand. Perhaps just 5 minutes of silence with your morning coffee, or writing down 3 things you appreciate about yourself. And please, share this video with someone you know might be silently carrying the same pain, to remind them they're not alone, and that it's never too late to learn the gentle art of loving oneself.